for that wonderful introduction, and I love the collage that you put together on the screen. That's really cool. That's a good summary of who I am and what I do. And this little logo down in the bottom right-hand corner is the logo for the tool that I'm going to be talking about today. So if you can stop sharing your screen, Yama, I'll have a chance to share mine.
Absolutely.
That's fantastic. Just before I do, let me put a little context around what I'm going to be talking about. We're trying to figure out how to get companies to pay more attention to sustainability. That's what we're doing. And as impact ambassadors, I know that's part of what you're doing as well. But having conversations with companies on this is sort of a tricky topic because they don't know what we're talking about when we talk about sustainability. It's a big word. It sounds like a complicated word. So it's hard to engage organizations in this the way we would like to. Large companies, we can have conversations and expect them to have people on staff that maybe are paying attention to this. Small and medium-sized enterprises, not so much. And we really don't have good ways for them to assess how the heck they're doing on sustainability issues, environmental and social. There are many different frameworks out there that are being encouraged for organizations to use, but frankly, they're a little bit daunting for most small and medium-sized enterprises. You're probably aware of this, but in Canada, if you were to take the normal way of defining a small and medium-sized enterprise as a company which has 500 employees or less, what percent of the companies in Canada do you think have 500 employees or less, roughly?
90?
That's warm, but it's low.
$95.
That's getting warmer, still low.
$97.
Okay, now we're getting quite warm. So, or 98, as someone said in the chat. It's actually 99.8. 99.8% of the companies in Canada have 500 employees or less. If you drop it down to 100 employees or less, according to Statistics Canada, 98.2. 100 employees or less. In the US, same thing. In Europe, same thing. In Africa and South America, higher. What we're talking about is the fact that the majority, by far the huge majority of companies on the planet are small and medium-sized enterprises. And to get them engaged in this thing called sustainability, or to have a more positive impact on the environment and the communities in which they operate, is a real challenge because they're just trying to stay alive. And they don't see this as part of that effort or connected to that effort. So we need ways of reassuring them that actually being a better company from a sustainability perspective helps them be a better company from a financial perspective. And one of the first things you need to do when you have conversations with them is kind of step back and get a baseline assessment of where they are now on those issues. That's the kind of tool that I'm going to be talking about today. And the only reason I created this tool is because the tools that are already out there are not, from my humble perspective, as SME friendly as they need to be. There is a tool called the Sdg Action Manager. It was put together by B Lab, and you heard that I'm a B Corp, and I'm on the B Corp Standards Advisory Council, so I'm pretty close to B Corps. It was put together by them on behalf of the United Nations, the United Nations Global Compact. But it seems still to me too many questions, hundreds of questions, and it's sort of a convoluted flow of the questions as well. And I don't think it is fair to small and medium-sized enterprises to ask them to fill that out, to be very candid with you. I was hoping, really hoping that it would do the trick because I strongly believe that we need a better tool. And because that didn't fulfill the bill and because it doesn't look like they're going to change it, I decided to create my own. That's what I'm going to talk to you about. So Let me just share my screen here. So the tool is called the Basic Sustainability Assessment Tool. It's called basic because it's intended for small and medium-sized enterprises. There's an advanced version of this, which is for larger, multinational, multi-country, multi-product, multi-everything sort of corporations. So that little 0.2% of those companies could use the advanced version. I'm going to talk about the basic version. So this used to be called the 3-in-1 Sustainability Assessment Toolkit. And you'll see why it's called 3-in-1 in a few minutes. But I changed it to basic. I may relabel it again to SME, Sustainability Assessment Toolkit, to be real specific. So playing with the name, it's on release 1.4 now. And I keep updating it and changing it and road testing it and so on. So what you're looking at is something which is relatively new on the scene. And I encourage you to try it out. So here's what it's all about. It really tries to help companies, especially the uninitiated in the sustainability realm, self-assess on the core sustainability things. So let me just start with what we mean when we're talking about sustainability. And usually, as you know, the three legs of the three-legged stool have to do with the environment and society and business. So, or the economy. So I call this model of how we show those three in relationship to each other as the nested interdependencies model. I used to use the three-legged stool model of economic, environmental, and social legs all being important, or the whole thing would fall over. But I think this is a better representation, to tell you the truth. So if you look at us from somewhere else, from the universe, mostly what you see is environment. You see air, clouds, you see water, and you see land. And if you look really closely, you see people on land, mostly on land. As of this morning, there are 7.855 billion of us on the planet. And I know that because I do a head count every night. There goes my credibility. Anyway, there are a lot of us on the planet, and it's growing daily. And when we're trying to get along with each other, we do things for each other for free, if it's family and friends. On the other hand, if they're not family and friends, we may do it for fee, and that leads to businesses. So we have for-profit businesses that operate in society, providing things, goods and services for people. And this is the relationship of those three things. And just to help you understand the importance of the environment, here's the punchline for this relationship. Society and business are wholly owned subsidiaries of the environment. That's business speak for the fact that the environment is too big to fail. The services, the ecosystem services, the 19 of them that are provided to us for free from the environment are in bad shape. About 60% of them are really stressed. So we need to be a little careful that we don't overly impact the holding company, because if the holding company goes out of business, we go out of business. And even the possibility of that has never, ever been on the radar screen until lately. And it looks like we need to be a little more careful about how we are treating the holding company, because the holding company is starting to become very stressed, at risk because of the impacts. And that's because over the last 250 years, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, all of us, but especially businesses, have been impacting both the environment and society. There are some positive impacts, but on the other hand, unfortunately, a lot of the so-called progress has some very, very unfortunate so-called externalities. And the impacts on society and the environment are starting to accumulate to the point that they're becoming a significant concern, not only to the environment and society, but ironically to businesses, because businesses are starting to experience a boomerang impact. So what they have been continuously expecting for free from the environment, water, materials, food, all of those things are becoming more scarce or more problematic. And if their source of input for what it is that they're doing starts to become in jeopardy, this becomes a big business issue. And if the extent to which the haves and the have-nots in society is starting to become a bigger and bigger chasm, then these social injustice issues start to become personal for business as well, because fingers start getting pointed at them as being at the root cause of some of those things, what they pay their people, how they treat their communities, etc., how much tax they pay, all that kind of stuff. So what's happened in the last 10 to 15 years is that business is becoming held more and more accountable for the impacts that it's having. And it's starting to realize that it is starting to be impacted by its impacts. And therefore, the expectation is that business will clean up its act and maybe even be restorative or regenerative. So that's the backdrop of what's going on in the business community. A large part of that business community is small and medium-sized enterprises. So we need to provide them with tools that allow them to see how they're doing so far on those impacts and decide which of those impacts they would like to improve. So if we take a look at a business model, which can mirror this, this is a generic business model. A business model shows what the company does and how it does it. And really what we're showing here is that any company, and by the way, I'm using the term business, this could easily be organization. It could be a government. It could be a municipality. It could be a non-governmental organization. It could be a university. It could be any organization. All of them, to do what they do, need to have some energy, water, and materials, directly or indirectly, coming into the organization. They do something with it to add value to it, using their employees to help make that happen. And they produce products, which people, or services, it could be goods or services, which people use, and when they're finished with them, they do something with them. Historically, what they've done is they throw them out. But in a circular economy, we try to make sure that that becomes input to either the company's own processes or somebody else's processes. So that's the flow that we're looking at in a typical business. As byproducts of what it does, it's going to impact the environment from its operations and impact the community. So there are three places where it impacts the environment: from its operations, from the input side, from the output side, and it also impacts the community and its employees. So when we talk about impact ambassadors, what we're talking about is improving the impacts of the company at those 5 points. And depending on your passion for particular issues, some of the ones that are closer to the social aspect, the community and the employees, may be the focus of your effort. But when you talk about impact investors, they may also share that interest in the social part and the environmental part. So when we talk about impact, we're talking about improving our impact on both of those, although depending on the individual and the organization, they may feel that one of those is more appropriate than the other: impact on the environment or society. And I'm including the employees as part of the social part because they're part of society. They just happen to work for the company. So that's the part of society that the business most directly can impact. You with me on this so far? Any questions at all about this? So that in about 5 minutes was how the world works and the science-based way in which it works, and the reality of how we are connected to everything in what we do and how we do it, and that we can have impacts on everything in what we do and how we do it, and we need to be a little bit more careful about that. So let's suppose we came to a small and medium-sized enterprise, And we said, would you please self-assess the impacts that you're having on these 5 points? They probably would not understand the question. So we need to kind of ease them into it and give them a tool that helps them do that. And that's where the basic Sustainability Assessment Toolkit comes in. So what it does is it gives them an opportunity to score themselves on the core. Now, ESG, get used to that term. That's environmental, social, and governance, and it's a synonym for sustainability. So what we've got here is a way that they can score themselves on all of those issues. You know, the core issues associated with the impact points that we just looked at, and we'll talk about that. As of last week, there are 35 questions. It used to be 36, but there are 35 questions, less than 50. That's my design point, less than 50 questions for a small and medium-sized enterprise. I think the number of questions is important when we're talking to organizations that are kind of new to this. The other part that you'll notice here is that I take the scores on those issues and I translate them into scores on the Sustainable Development Goals and the scores on the so-called non-financial capitals, natural, human, and social capital. I'll show you more about that later, but let's zero in on this. So core issues, what are we talking about on the core issues? So as a part of an effort that I was a part of, and I'm still on the board of the Future Fit Foundation, but a few years ago, we created something called the Future Fit Business Benchmark. It's the only science-based benchmark for companies that's out there. And what we tried to do is try to figure out what science says are the goals that we should have for all of these impacts. And as a part of that effort, I compared what we were looking at with what other frameworks like the Sustainable Development Goals, the Global Reporting Initiative, SASB, there's a whole lot of different frameworks out there. And I tried to determine what they had as the core issues. So these are some of the different frameworks that I looked at. And if you wanted to see what this analysis actually looks like, the URL at the bottom of the slide that you are being provided with will take you to, on my website, you can download this comparison for free. And basically what I was looking at were a bunch of self-assessment frameworks and a bunch of third-party rating and ranking frameworks that are used. And what I was asking basically is, what are they all asking about? Like, do they all ask about energy and water and waste and pollution and greenhouse gases? Like, what do they all have in common? They may use different language or different emphasis, but are they basically all asking about the same things? So I spread them all out in this massive spreadsheet, and that's what's available at this URL. And I took a look at them. And what I found was basically they're all talking about the same stuff. So what we have here are the core ESG topics. Most of them talk about governance, how the company runs itself, the board's policies and all of that good stuff. And then they talk about 7 environmental things, 5 employee-related things, and 5 community-related things. And depending on which of the frameworks you're talking about, some of them spend more time on that than others, or zero in on a subset of them quite strongly. But I won't go through what all of those are. I just want to reassure you that the topics that we're going to be looking at with this tool are the ones that are the most common, the most usual, the normal. In fact, they are the core topics that we talk about when we're talking about a company and its sustainability track record. So what are we talking about? We're talking about 3 things. How is it impacting the environment? How is it treating its employees? And how is it impacting the community? That's it. And if it's doing the right things on all of those, it's sustainable. And if it's not, it's not. It's only taken me about 20 years to get to this, but that's the way it is. So basically, this isn't complicated. We've only got 18 things that they need to pay attention to, and we can figure out whether they are doing enough attention or paying enough attention to these things by very cleverly using the tool. So we're talking about the impact points here. So this is how we take those 18 things and we show where they are going to be in play at those impact points. So on the input side, It has to do with the materials and the stuff that's coming into the company through procurement and energy and water. That's what comes in. On the operations side and on the product side, we talk about the extent to which the company itself or the products that it produce create greenhouse gases, other kinds of emissions, waste, or encroach on nature or highly sensitive cultural locations. So what we're talking about here are 4 things on the output side that we need to be careful about, the impacts on those things, and 3 things on the input side. So those are the 7 environmental things. In terms of employees, basically what we're talking about here is don't do any harm to these things. I mean, it's a low bar to set, but for some companies, this is a high bar. And we'll know that we're not doing any harm to the employees if we're paying them enough, we're looking after their health, we're not hurting them, and we're not killing them. Employment terms, concerns process, we listen to them, and we're doing all of the right things on all of the different forms of discrimination that sometimes happen in the workplace. And on the community side, we make sure that we're having a positive impact on the community, that we're paying all of the right taxes in the right places at the right time. We're conducting our business ethically. We're lobbying for the right things, or not, at least not lobbying for the wrong things. And we are investing in companies that are on this wavelength as well. Plus the governance, which is overseeing all of it. And a lot of the governance approach has to do with how much attention you pay to these other things. Those are the 18 things. How are we doing so far? Just making sense?
Yes, very interesting. Making absolute sense. Thank you.
So what we need to do then is to help companies assess themselves. And it would be nice if the scale were a consistent scale on which they can make this assessment. And it is. It's a scale of 0 to 100%. And if they score 100% on all of these things, including governance, they're sustainable. And if they don't, they're not. Very simple. So the question is, to what extent are they getting close to the point that they are not doing any harm on all of these things? So every one of these has got a science-based goal as to what science says we need to get to if everything's going to be okay for a human civilization trying to exist on a finite planet. And science is basically saying we've got to stop a whole lot of things that we have gotten away with over the years, because the accumulative effect of all of that is very problematic. So greenhouse gases, none. Non-greenhouse gas emissions, 0. Waste, 0. Encroachment, 0. Are there any questions? So what we're being is very specific. Science is telling us we have got to get our act together as a civilization on this planet, and certainly businesses as a part of society need to be part of that. But all of this applies to you and me, as well as homes and neighborhoods and municipalities and universities and governments and so on. So it's consistent, but it's especially true for business. All right, so let's suppose we were able to do that, and the tool does that. So you come up with a score on all of those things. So I'm going to show you what that might look like.
There's a question, Bob.
Thank you.
Is asking if there is a tool for startups.
In terms of the business model that you want to create as a startup, you need to figure out the way in which all of these things are going to look for you, the employees and where you get them from and how you're going to treat them and so on. So you can use this as kind of a blueprint for how you want to start up and not have to later on figure out how you're going to use less energy and less water and fewer greenhouse gas emissions. You can design these kinds of things in from the beginning. So you don't have to later on retrofit everything back to fit this. You can from the beginning make an assessment of that. And there are tools that help you do that. There's something called the Flourishing Business Canvas, which helps you assess how you're doing on all of those things and play with different ways of approaching things and come up with some metrics that are based on this kind of analysis. as to how they compare to each other. So yes, this thinking is very appropriate for entrepreneurs as they're trying to figure out what they want to do and how they're going to do it, so that they can start off with as positive an impact as possible on all of these impact points. Any other questions?
Yes. Yama, do you mind if I go ahead? Okay. Hi, Bob. Nice to see you again. So a very quick question. I really like your 18 core principles and the governance structure and everything. And I have a very small question. Most of you must be aware of the Halliburton loophole. And there's more examples out there of similar loopholes in the policy structures. Sometimes governments are influenced by big corporations, and sometimes smaller organizations, especially SMEs, are influenced by government policies, which may or may not be favorable. How do we ensure sustainable functioning or operations of an organization in a highly volatile government scenario where the economy is rapidly developing, but nobody knows what can happen the next day? And with what we are doing right now in the past few years and where we are progressing after the pandemic, chances are a lot of governments will be changing a lot of policies. What should the new, like the startups, somebody just asked, I think Seda just asked, the startups, but also SMEs and bigger corporations should take into account to maintain sustainability, given the volatile nature of the governments over the next few years?
Great question, but that's for a different session. So
That's all right.
today I'm
Thank you.
talking about the what. You're talking about the why. And the why is absolutely crucial, really, really important. And the question is, what's going to cause a company, especially a small and medium-sized enterprise or a startup, to pay attention to this stuff in the first place? I mean, why would they care? Like, what's in it for them to do this self-assessment? Like, who's asking? I mean, if you went to them and asked them to do it, or if I went to them and asked them to do it, or Yama went to them, they'd say, take a hike. We're kind of busy. We're just trying to survive, for goodness sakes. Like, this isn't something that we've got time to do. Well, we care about it, of course, but not right now. We're kind of busy. So usually as citizens, we think, well, we need to get their attention. So wouldn't it be helpful if the government forced them, regulated them into doing this kind of analysis? Well, good luck with that in North America. As you mentioned, the corporate influence on government in Canada and the US makes it very, very problematic that the governments are going to have the courage to do what needs to be done in putting in regulations that are going to require this kind of reporting. For whatever reason, in Europe, governments are more listened to by businesses. They're not as influenced by lobbyists as we seem to be in North America. So in Europe, they are instating a requirement that companies report on all of this stuff, the big guys, down to 500 employees. And now they're looking at taking it deeper into the business sector. And they're talking about companies not only assessing how they're doing on their own operation, but very much on the supply chain as well, because companies are mutually accountable for what's going on in their supply chain. So it's wonderful. I mean, the Europe, as usual, is years ahead of us. But I don't trust government any more than you do, because they come and they go, you know. So none of the stuff that I talk about is dependent on government interventions. But if you want to know why companies are going to be more inclined to pay attention to this than they used to be, a white paper that I wrote a couple of months ago called The 21st Century Sustainable Enterprise Force Field talks about the forces that are causing companies to pay attention to this and the forces that are always pushing back against that, and the way in which the helping forces are starting to get a little stronger than they used to be, and the causes of that, which are causing companies to start paying attention to stuff as business issues, not save the planet issues. And when that happens, magic happens. So if a small and medium-sized enterprise is in the supply chain of a large company or a government, like the federal government buys $20 billion worth of goods and services every year. Federal government of Canada, $20 billion of goods and services. If you add in the goods and services that are purchased every year by provincial governments, territorial governments, and municipalities, the public sector, it's $200 billion. So let's suppose the government's got religion on this and got serious about actually trying to make the SDGs, because they can't do it on their own. They need help from business. And they said to all of their suppliers who are providing them with this $200 billion worth of goods and services, by the way, if you want to do business with us, if you want to maintain your position as one of our suppliers or join our supplier community, what we'd like you to do is just tell us how you're doing on this stuff, because we want to use sustainable procurement. And sustainable procurement makes sure that we get the best value for our money by buying the most sustainable products and services from the most sustainable companies. And we are going to give a priority, a weight, a preference to organizations that are the most sustainable, because we know that they're going to be the most resilient, and the kind of turbulence that you described in your question is not going to go away. It's going to get worse. And what they want to do is deal with suppliers that are ready for that, that are fit for the future in the 21st century. Because we may think that this is just a temporary kind of problem. Get ready for it. This is not temporary. There is going to be permanent turbulence. All bets are off in the 21st century. We can't predict anywhere the way we used to from previous trend lines. We can't just continue those. So we need companies that are ready for that, that are resilient, that are sustainable. So if the government said to a small and medium-sized enterprise, could you please tell us how sustainable you are? I think the sustainable enterprise, the supplier, would be more inclined to answer that question than if you and I asked them. That's called a market force. And that, to me, is a heck of a lot more powerful than a government putting in a regulation. So rather than using a regulation to get their attention, use sustainable procurement to get their attention. And that's frankly why in the next few years, that is my main focus, sustainable procurement. I think that's the biggest lever that for some reason we haven't pulled yet, but the biggest lever we have on behaviors in the business community. And I've got a bunch of tools to help do all of that. So that's a very long answer to a very short question, but a very important question, which is what's going to provoke these organizations to pay more attention to this and go through the exercise of self-assessing. And it's got to be a more compelling stakeholder than you and me that's going to ask them to do that. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you, Bob.
So for an even longer answer, take a look at the white paper that I mentioned, the 21st Century Sustainable Enterprise Force Field. It's featured on my homepage. And I think you'll find it reinforces all of the things that are happening these days. I call it 21st century because these forces were not there 20 years ago. They are now, and it's exciting. And it's up to folks like you and me to amplify those things. Okay, so at the risk of actually finishing on time, let me just continuing along here. Was there another question, Yama?
No, I just want to say that the links have been shared on the chat. So anyone interested in learning more about the white paper and about sustainable procurement, the link is there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. All right, so let's suppose we can come up with a score, and the tool helps you do that. And you might display the scores something like this. And this is what's called a dashboard. And when you're running a business, you kind of want to know how things are going. So what I've got here are not only the environmental and social and governance things, but I've also included the financial things. So you could be the CEO of the organization, you step back and you take a look at this and you say, geez, energy, it's only 11%? Like, wow, it seems to me that that's something we should be paying more attention to. Like, are we not doing the right things on that? Or this greenhouse gas emissions is only 30%? Maybe we should look at that a little bit more too. So you can start to decide where you want to pay more attention, where you want to invest more time and money to make improvements. Once you've got this dashboard of all of them. So you can start to use this as a management tool to run your organization in a better way, because some of these things may be more material to you than others. And this gives you a chance to see how all of those impacts are looking. And if you want to zero in on the social ones, go for it. Like maybe there are ways to improve the community impacts part. And I should also mention that the tool has 10 questions that have to do with not doing less harm, but doing good. So there are 10 questions, 7 on the environmental side, 3 on the social side, that ask you, are you actually doing something positive, restorative, regenerative on these issues? And it gives you a bunch of prompts as to what some of those things might look like. And then it encourages you to describe those impacts in the way that the Impact Management Project in the UK is encouraging everybody to describe them. Like, and basically it's 5 dimensions. And so if a company says, hey, we're having a really good impact, you say, oh, really? On what? They say, oh, on the community. You say, oh, really? How? So what you want to do is you be able to give organizations a consistent set of things, dimensions, that they should include in their description. So the first thing is what it is. The second thing is how many people are being impacted. That's the scale. The depth of that impact, like, is this just a trivial thing, like you're giving someone a cookie, or are you feeding them for life? The third thing is the extent to which this has a ripple effect in not only that recipient of the benefit of whatever you're doing, but others around them in the community. And then the last one is the extent to which this would have happened anyway, even if the company had not done anything, that this other groups would have made this happen. How important, how significant is the company's contribution to this in order to make it happen? And also, what's the risk if the company's help stops for whatever reason? What happens? What's the risk? Will it continue? Will this initiative continue? Or are people going to be left in the lurch? So it gives you an opportunity to describe how all of those things work, whether you're helping farmers or whether you're helping the disadvantaged in the community or whatever. So what I'm trying to reassure you is that these questions come up with scores, and those scores are 2 things. It's how close they are to doing no harm, and the bonus that's added to that score is based on those good things that it's doing. So those are bonus scores that are added to give you the overall score. So actually these scores could be over 100% if they're doing a lot of good stuff as well as doing no harm. So those are the scores on the sustainability type things, the ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And governance, by the way, is absolutely the most important part of the whole thing. It determines whether they pay attention to this or not, and it also determines the extent to which the people who are running the organization are going to be compensated for their attention to these things. Very, very important. All right, so let's suppose you say, yeah, this is, sorry, go ahead.
It's a quick question. So 100% score means they're sustainable, and below 100% is not sustainable, and above is doing positive impact.
Right.
More, yeah.
Right. And if you're over 100%, then you're being regenerative, you're being restorative, you're having a positive impact. A lot of companies, and understandably, a lot of companies think they're having a positive impact if they cause less harm. And in a way they are, but it's a terminology thing. And if we want to give them credit for that, that's fine. But they need to understand that causing less harm is just the warm-up act. What they really need to do is to try to figure out how to go further and do some good. And there are lots of suggestions on how they can do that, especially on the environmental side and on the community side. So there are over 50 suggestions that we prompt them with as to whether they are directly or indirectly through NGOs that they are contributing to and so on, causing positive impacts. So we give them credit for their donations as well. SDGs. What's all of this got to do with the SDGs? Let's suppose the preferred framework for all of this stuff is not the core issues that I was talking about before, but the Sustainable Development Goals. And I know you're familiar with these, so I won't belabor them. They're colorful, they're numbered. Frankly, I have never been able to figure out the logic behind the numbering, but that's beside the point. They're numbered and they're colorful, and they cover everything. I mean, you take a look at it, you say, well, what's missing as a blueprint for the kind of society that I would like my kids and my grandkids to live in? Pretty good. Pretty good. You might find a couple of things that aren't explicitly mentioned there, but as you drill down into the 169 targets and the 232 indicators associated with those targets for these 17 things, you will probably find whatever you think is missing. Really, really good. So that's the good news. It's a heck of a good blueprint. Unfortunately, though, the articulation of the targets associated with this are more appropriate for the public sector, for governments, than they are for businesses. And businesses really struggle with the terminology and the language and so on. So what they do is they cherry pick a few. So you ask a business, are you paying attention to the SDGs? They'll say, absolutely. Yeah, we really care about those things. And especially these 5. And then they celebrate those in their reports and so on. And they try to convince themselves and others that they really give a hoot about all of them, but they're just starting with these 5. And the most common ones are the ones that you see here. So if you took a look at what large corporations are paying attention to, most of them are paying attention to climate change, responsible consumption and production, which gets into the circular economy, decent work, that's the workplace, and economic growth. They love the economic growth part. Gender equality, which is just the beginning of diversity, and good health and well-being. So those 5 are the most common ones. But the others, depending on the jurisdiction, are also being used by organizations. I would humbly suggest that our trust of businesses is so low these days that maybe it would be good if they assess themselves on all of them, so we don't think they're not assessing themselves on some of them because they're really terrible on them. So just to kind of raise their credibility and their trust with the public, as well as investors and so on, I am strongly encouraging organizations to self-assess against all of them. Then they can decide which of those are the ones that they want to invest improvements in. So how the heck do they do that? Well, it's a piece of cake. What we can do is we can take these 17 and reorganize them. There are 6 of them that are related to the environment: water, energy, materials that are being hopefully recirculated in the circular economy, climate change, life on land, life on water. Those are all environmental ones. Then there are social ones. And some parts of society actually work for the company, so they have a more direct impact on those. So there are 6 of them that we're calling employee-related goals, and the other are the remaining ones for the community. So what we've taken the liberty of doing here is dividing them into 3 clusters, which happily map to the 3 clusters that we're looking at anyway: environmental, employee, and community goals. And in fact, we can be even more explicit, and we can take the SDGs and show how they are associated with the same things that we were looking at before. So if we can come up with scores on these core ESG things, we can translate those scores into scores on their associated, their aligned, their primary SDGs. So greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, I mean, it's a no-brainer. Non-greenhouse gas emissions, waste and encroachment get into the way in which we're impacting life on land and life on underwater. So this is not rocket science. And in fact, the UN Global Compact is working on something that they call SDG Ambition, which is doing exactly this, talking about how the normal things that we look at from a sustainability perspective map to the SDGs. And they've done that for 10 of them. I've done it for all 17. So let's suppose then we were to do that. And it's a pretty simple mapping of the scores. And we end up then with scores on the SDGs. So we can take the scores that we had on the ESGs and map them so that we end up with scores on the SDGs. It's beautifully simple. Beautifully simple. And that allows them to articulate their impacts in that language, in that terminology, if that is their preferred terminology or the preferred terminology of whoever is asking them to do this. So this is a different way of describing that. And there are other people, there's a third group, very often associated with the investment community, the finance community, that prefers a third set of terminology, capitals. They love capitals, financial capital, manufactured capital. And then they get into this stuff and they don't call it what we call it. They call it natural capital, human capital, and social capital. So we can take those capitals and we can map them to the same core things. Natural capital is the stuff coming in on the input side from the environment and the output side as well. Social capital is all the community stuff. And human capital, HR, human resources, personnel, that's all this stuff. So come up with scores on these things and we can map them to scores on the capital. So natural capital, combination of on the input side and the output side, social and relationship capital, human capital, and of course we're continuing to carry these things along too in our dashboard and governance as well. So what we have here is a tool that makes it easy to come up with scores in whatever terminology or using whatever framework is the preferred one by whoever is asking us to do this. Or for our own purposes internally, for management purposes, the ones that we prefer internally to help us decide which ones are the ones we want to invest in. So the tool does all of that. It's free, it's open source, and it's an Excel workbook. There are no macros in it. There are no hidden, locked cells. You can do whatever you want with it. It's tailorable. And when I say open source, that's the intent. If you think that there's a better way of asking the question or other questions that should be asked for a particular sector, add them. It's real simple. And how the calculations are done, you can see exactly how they're done. It's not tricky. They're all SME, it's all very SME friendly because it's got only 35 questions and the language is as uncomplicated as I can possibly think of it. A lot of checklists like, do you do this, do you do this, do you do this? So it's very multiple choice type thing. It's based on the two best, from my humble perspective, frameworks on the planet, the B Corp Business Impact Assessment and the Sdg Action Manager and the Future Fit Business Benchmark. So I've taken the best of the way they ask about progress on these things and used it here. It's comprehensive, covers everything, not just cherry picking the things that companies think they want to ask about. It's progress towards science-based goals. It gives bonus points for progress enablers, the positive stuff, the regenerative, reconstructive, restorative stuff, gives credit for how well you're managing those things, and it's wonderfully educational. And there's also an online version. I mentioned that up here. I don't know if you've heard of this thing, but there's this magic thing called Spreadsheet Converter. Spreadsheet Converter takes an Excel spreadsheet and converts it into an online app. It's phenomenal. I tried it many years ago, and for some reason I could not get it to work. I don't know whether it was me or it, or my computer system. It just didn't work worth a darn. But I tried it again at Christmas, because every time I tried to get somebody to create an online version of this thing, it was going to cost thousands and thousands of dollars. And I thought, oh, damn, I don't think that's the right approach. So in fact, one company wanted $30,000 to generate it. So I use Spreadsheet Converter. I've got a license. I think it cost me $650 for a life, as many times as I want to use it. I mean, it's phenomenal. And I've created an online version. So if you go to my website under Frameworks and Assessment Tools, there is a link that allows you to download the Excel version. If you want to play with that, that's terrific. And there's also a link to the online version, and you can use that as well if you want to. It's really cool. Operates in the cloud in the Spreadsheet Converter cloud. It's magic. So there is a tool here. There's a flyer that describes all of the governance questions that are asked, the way in which the core ESG issues. Let me just pull this up a bit. So it shows how the scores on these things that we've talked about, the core issues, plus some enabling things, positive things, lead to scores on the SDGs as well as on the capitals that we talked about. So this is kind of a summary flyer as well. So that's available as an overview of it too. So this is one of the tools. I've got a bunch of other tools that help justify doing this in the first place, how to talk to executives and boards, a lot on the sustainable procurement side. Set of master slide decks that you can subscribe to that have over 800 slides in it that are the backup to the backup to the backup for all of this stuff. And I update them every quarter, change about 30 to 50 slides every 3 months. Every time a report comes out on this stuff, I summarize it in a PowerPoint slide and add it to the deck, take other stuff and update it. So that's a good resource actually for, and in fact, well, I think of it, Yama, as a professor, if you wanted to use that as a resource for any of your classes, you could subscribe to it and make all of the slides available to your class.
Yes, that's I actually did last year and it was great. Lots of resources, very well organized. It's amazing.
So there are, I think the underlying message there, just to make sure you understand, sorry. The reason I'm showing you this is I want to reassure you that if you really care about this stuff and you want to make a difference, we're much better prepared these days than we used to be with tools that can help you be an effective change agent. This is just my stuff. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff out there. My stuff is all free and open source except for the slides. But that's only $39 a year to subscribe. Try them, and if you don't like them, stop. But the other stuff that are all of the tools are free and open source, and I really do encourage you to see if they might be of use to you. So let me stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Bob. It was a great presentation. I'll personally learn a lot, and I'm sure everybody learned a lot about the tool, about the whole sustainability, corporate sustainability strategy, and it's amazing. It's amazing that the work that you do, and lots of these resources you provide for free. And if there's any cost like the subscription for the slides, it's very minimum amount, which is amazing. And thank you so much for all your support and contribution to our community.
Okay, and if another session would be useful in any of the other stuff, Yama, don't be shy. By the way, if you're wondering my business model and why I'm making all of this stuff available for free, it's pretty straightforward. I've got kids and I've got grandkids, and we need to get some stuff done quickly, and we're running out of runway on a whole lot of it. So we need folks like you to figure out how you can make a difference and who with, and exert some influence, and not be inhibited by not having good tools available to help you be more effective change agents. So it's very selfish of me to give this stuff away because I need your help. Pinder.
How are you, Bob?
Good. How are you?
I don't know if you remember me, but it's been quite some time. You've been leading the charge here in Canada since you left IBM many years ago, and I've had a chance to follow your work and hear you speak for some time.
Oh, this is starting to ring a bell, Rupinder. We have connected before.
Yeah. You came and spoke at our sustainability conference in 2013 in East Gwillimbury when I was organizing that.
Wow.
But at that, we had seen you at the Sustainability Speaker Series, and
yes,
it's been quite a challenge seeing how long this decade's been. So thank you for making yourself available today and speaking to all of us. From your work, I don't know if you've been asked this before, but from your work, what would you say is one of your biggest successes that you've enjoyed, either on the consulting side or on your own personal impact that you've had on a company where they've actually actioned on it, if you can share?
Yeah, this is sort of an awkward question for me because I don't really do consulting the way you would normally think of consulting. I do projects. I did a project with CPA Canada, it's Chartered Professional Accountants Canada, to create education for directors and executives on why they need to pay attention to climate change. So I did that. I developed some online courses for Fleming College, 3 online courses on sustainability for a certificate program that they did. So I do that kind of project. I'm going to be doing some stuff on sustainable procurement this year, but I don't do the kind of consulting that you're talking about. So I actually am flying blind on this. I really don't know how any of the stuff that I'm doing is making a difference. I occasionally get a little feedback from somebody that said that something I said many, many years ago, or that they read that I'd written, changed their lives or something like that. But, you know, I'm flying blind. It's a leap of faith. I'm sort of the Johnny Appleseed of the sustainability circuit. I'm trying to plant a bunch of seeds. I have no idea whether they're taking root, but maybe at some time, I catch people at the right time with the right information, and it makes a difference. It helps them. But I don't know. When I started this, I was really pissed off that the business community wasn't doing as much as it should be doing. And I thought, of course they're not, because there's nothing in it for them. Or we've done a terrible job of articulating what's in it for them to do more than they're already doing. And that led me to a quest for a good way to articulate the business case. And I couldn't find it. I saw lots of articles and even books that had the word business case in the title, but they weren't. They weren't business cases. So I thought, damn it, I guess I should create one. So that's what my master's project was at the University of Toronto when I was still working part-time at IBM. Then I thought the business case, which is my first 2 books, the Sustainability Advantage and the New Sustainability Advantage, was so compelling, I couldn't figure out why more companies weren't doing it. So that's what I did my doctorate on, what's getting in the way of companies doing that, which ended up with the next Sustainability Wave book. So one thing leads to another. And frankly, I think the stars are starting to align on a lot of this stuff, and the receptivity and the readiness of leaders of businesses to have this conversation is higher. But the pace is still not what it needs to be. So, you know, I feel like I'm just getting warmed up. We really need to pick up the pace, and we need a lot more smart folks like you to help us do that, and connect with decision makers and help them see that these decisions that would help them do more in a positive way on the environment and society are also going to be good for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had